Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back. Father Richard, Georgie, thank you for having me. I mean, when I came 3 years ago, Dirrum Festival was just starting, but to be here today and just see all of these amazing speakers and to see the commitment to action beyond this is inspiring. So I don't know where he is, Father Richard. I can't see him, but there he is at the back. I just want to give you and the whole Radford College an amazing round of applause, please. When I was asked to speak about my work at Global Citizen, they told me, perhaps there's a subtle hint in what they're telling me. They said, we've heard all about the polio stuff, so don't talk about that. We want to know about Global Citizen. And it's interesting, you would have thought, working for an organization called Global Citizen, that I get asked to speak about global citizenship a lot. Actually, I don't. And so it forced me to take a sit back and think, well, what does global citizenship mean to me? On a very practical level, not an abstract level, but very practical level. One of the experiences that came to mind was a couple of years ago when me and my best mate, Akram Azimi, who former Young Australian of the Year, he's spoken before, great speaker, we journeyed to Christmas Island. We went to Christmas Island because Akram, his story is well known, he was a refugee from Afghanistan. He was one of the lucky ones. He had fled through the Khyber Pass, ended up in Peshawar in northwestern Pakistan, and eventually after ringing around all the embassies, someone picked up the phone and said, yeah, all right mate, come on in, we'll give you an interview. And of course, the rest is history, he ended up here in Australia. But we knew that only happens to 1% of refugees globally, and Akram very sensibly at the time said he didn't want to make his year as Young Australian of the Year about him being a refugee. He felt if he started talking out, people would know him just for being a refugee, not as a person. So we made a commitment that we would wait until the end of the year when we journeyed to Christmas Island. We spent a few days over that month in the detention centres, and we journeyed around the island. We worked with some of the teachers. And at the end of that experience, I remember the community worker, kind of have a community social worker who liaises between the centre and the local community on Christmas Island. He took us up to this cliff. Beautiful, beautiful island. It really is paradise. And then we went up on this cliff and we looked out over the bay area. And he told us this story about how a few years ago, a ship had come in carrying asylum seekers and how it had broken up on the reef. And he told us about how many of the people had died. He spoke about how, remembering harrow stories of mothers climbing up this rope, having babies on their back, and how waves crashed on their backs, and how suddenly the babies weren't there, and how people were climbing up and the waves would crash, and then eventually there was no one left on the rope climbing up. After telling us the story, he showed us the memorial that the community themselves laid. And on the memorial, etched on the stone, is this saying, please remember the perilous journey of asylum seekers, for anyone's death diminishes us all. For those familiar with the work of the 16th century poet, Sir John Donne, you'll know that comes from his poem where he says, no man is an island entire of himself. Any man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Do not toll forth the bell, it tolls for thee. And at the end of that, we heard that experience and we were speaking to this community worker, and suddenly Akram turned to him, put his hand on this guy's shoulder, and he said, well, one consolation, mate, is I'm glad you're here with the island offering these guys support, working with these kids. Some of them, we were with the unaccompanied minors. And I remember this guy turned to us and he kind of had this hysterical laugh. It wasn't a good laugh. You could tell it definitely wasn't a good laugh. And he said, oh, well, that won't happen much longer. I've just received notice. We said, what do you mean? He goes, I've just received notice from the minister's office saying my services are no longer required. That was October 2013, and it was the same week that an edict was issued to the staff on the island that from now on, irregular arrivals by boat would now be referred to as illegal arrivals by boat. Fast forward 3 and a bit years later, and I'm standing in our office in downtown Manhattan. Global Citizen, we're now this big, huge advocacy organization. I lead advocacy efforts globally. I spend my hours during the day lobbying UN ambassadors, trying to find their time. And I'm there, and I'm speaking to them. And that day, where we are is in particular on this day, it's the 20th of January 2017. And we're piling into our boardroom. We've got 80 staff and we're piling in. We can't all fit in, so we're squeezed. I'm right at the back, ducking in my head. And on our TV, we're broadcasting live the inauguration of Donald J. Trump. Now, many in our team, Global Citizen, were like, let's give this the benefit of the doubt. Some of us was like, let's not judge anything before we hear what he's got to say. But I got to tell you, as an organization with the name Global Citizen, every time we heard the words America first and the arguments around it was like a jab through the heart. When he said the words, to all people in the world around, know that a new order is being born here today. You know, I heard a cry from one of the staff. Of course, my American colleagues, the pain was even more so. You know, for us working at Global Citizen, this was probably the closest thing you could imagine to an existential crisis. For the last few years, we were convinced we was on this upward slope of progress. But for my American colleagues, same age as me, late 20s, early 30s, suddenly they did not even recognize the land they was born up. Didn't recognize this at all. They felt alienated in their own countries. And so, you know, it's easy as we sat around that table, many critics have told us over the years that global citizenship was just a pipe dream, that it wasn't possible, that it's for dreamers. And maybe as we sat there around that conference table watching this, maybe they were right. And maybe they've got cause to be right. After all, you know, millennials are known for being entitled, and damn well we sat there and we felt entitled about our future, and we said, this is not the world we were promised when we were born. You see, the year I was born was 1988, and the year after I was born, the fall of the Berlin Wall took place. And with that, all these outlandish arguments were made, which in hindsight might seem a bit silly, but we heard, you know, the philosopher Francis Fukuyama said, this is the end of history as we know it. You know, there's going to be no more great divisions. It's going to be, you know, nice inter-humanity, interstate relations. You know, it's going to be the great peace of our age. But of course, we know that nothing lasts forever. We know we only have to look at Iran, North Korea, Syria, where one of the worst civil wars and humanitarian situations in 70 years continues to wage, that didn't happen. And again, you know, this is not the first time these lofty promises have been made and that the expectations haven't been met. 200 years ago, in Belgium, what is now Belgium, a major war took place. And it culminated in big battles, the largest battle that had ever been fought before. It was called the Battle of Waterloo. And at that battle, Master Overlord of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, was defeated for the final time and sent to St. Helena in exile. And people predicted at the time, after that war, they said, thus begins the great peace of our age. And look, for a while they were right. In fact, for almost 100 years, there was some small wars there and here. There was no big wars. It looked like, you know, actually they might have been onto something. At the start of 1914, you had arguably the first generation in history, people who were my age at the time, who had never known anything but peace if you lived in the great capitals of the world. And yet, you know, as they were planning on celebrating a centenary of peace the following year, that was not to be, because we all know that same year, Europe's great calamity, mass suicide, featuring millions of deaths, took place in the First World War. And again, at the end of that year, what happened, we know at the end of that war, again, a great promise. Woodrow Wilson came in and said, this is the war to end all wars. We will have peace in our lifetime. Set up the League of Nations. And again, less than a generation later, and we know this from popular culture, and I watched Dunkirk, great film by the way, but we know from popular culture today that of course that didn't happen. You know, Second World War, one of the most brutal things that has ever occurred in the history of humanity. So, at the end of all this, you know, it's easy to look back at history and it's easy to say, why bother? Human beings, are we inherently selfish? Are we inherently self-interest? Are we inherently competitive? Are we doomed to go in this endless cycle? Do we really need Game of Thrones, which I love by the way, but do we really need it? Or do we just need to look at our own history? And yet, you probably can tell, I'm a massive history buff, I love history, but as much as I love history, sometimes I believe history can arguably repress more than it reveals. You know, Thomas Kuhn, scientific philosopher, used to say of science, he said, sometimes we make observations, and because they go against the grain when it comes to, they contradict existing expectations or the prevailing paradigms about the way things work, we choose to ignore those observations. We sing it in things like climate change. One of my favorites that I work on, one of the campaigns I'm passionate about, is actually water and sanitation. And we saw this in a big way. You see, today we know that one of the best ways to prevent people from getting sick is to have proper sanitation. Why? Because diseases, you know, carried by little microbes that when they go in the water supply make people sick from diseases like cholera. Believe it or not, 150 years ago, that was not what people believed. In fact, the prevailing paradigm was that actually you got sick through gases, not at all through these little microbes. In fact, come back to Game of Thrones in a way, when there was a scientist in the 1850s, in 1854, he created this diagram of Broad Street. And he tried to notice what was going on. He said, this is the pump. And he noticed where the water pump were, you can see the dots. Closest to that water pump were the outbreaks of cholera. He said, maybe there's a link between this dirty pump and the outbreaks and diseases. And he got chased into an early grave. They said, no, that's not the way, Jon Snow. That's not how it works. In fact, the guy who developed, that was his name, Jon Snow, this guy who developed the first known school of hygiene stood up, and this is a true story, he grabbed the veil of his own feces and drank it in front of an audience. I'm not going to do that here, but it's in front of an audience like this. And he said, you know, this doesn't get you sick. In fact, there's some nutritional benefits to it, is what he said. And yet, we know it took another 50 years of people dying needlessly because of that. Finally, reason prevailed. We had modern sewage systems, not in all parts of the world, even today, but certainly in the great cities. And I wonder, when it comes to how we look at state relations, international politics, human behavior, if we're really going to change, do we need to look at some of the hidden observations around human behavior and look at ways to capitalize on it and allow it to flourish? What am I talking about? Well, last year, a study came out. The same year you had Brexit, the same year you had, you know, this rise in many countries of this populist extremism. At the same time, a poll that had been run for almost 2 decades every year, basically surveying people on their attitudes to global citizenship, interconnectedness. For the first time, that poll found that almost 50% in 16 countries, including Australia, 1 in 2 people now see themselves as global citizens. Almost 50%. For the first time, and this is an upward trend that has only continued. Now, there are some observations and nuances around this that may or may not surprise you. When you break down that data, you actually see that where global citizenship is on the rise is actually in some of the emerging countries. You know, in Nigeria is a country that if you are born in northern Nigeria today, there is a 1 in 8 chance you will not live to see your 5th birthday. And yet, according to the data, it is the most openly global citizen-minded population in the world. And this is a country where you have Boko Haram killing and preventing girls from going to school. Now, of course, you look at the traditional developed countries, the UK and others, and it explains. But again, you look at the decline, perhaps, of global citizen. But again, it's more nuanced. You look at the youth, you look at where that is, and you look at the data there, and actually you see a split. In Brexit last year, 75% of young people that voted to remain. Some demographers have said this is an intergenerational problem that will resolve itself. And of course, I put this guy up here, Justin Trudeau, who we've had on our stage just a few times. You have leaders that actively show that you can nurture this and you can be proactive in shaping public consciousness. This man, when he was elected, no one would say Canada was the most globally minded country in North America. And yet, over a period of 2 years, he's taken the country, and Canada, according to the data, is now more globally minded than their southern brothers and sisters. In fact, the correlation is when you're more openly minded, you're also more receptive to others. And it's no surprise that Canada today, 77% of the population are more receptive to refugees when you have leaders that lead. Now, I'm not arguing that global citizen means that you abandon national identity. In fact, far from it. Many of those young people I just spoke about still have rich attachments to their history, to their religions, to their cultures. But what I am saying is that maybe there is something different about humanity. And what we've tried to do at Global Citizen over the years is we tried to develop a way of harnessing this. Rupert Murdoch has an audience of over 1 billion people, incredibly influential. What we felt is, well, there is clearly a consciousness inclined towards these issues. What if we can tap into that, harness it, and give it a pointy end, a weapon? That if our politicians don't lead, then there's a powerful constituency willing to hold them accountable. You see, the difference from today compared to all those times I showed you in the past is that we have our own tools available that were never available. I went to a conference a few years ago with Bill Clinton, and he held up his mobile phone and he said, because of one of these, young people today are more powerful than any previous generation of young people beforehand. In fact, he said one person, one of these, went so bold, is more powerful than what the President of the United States was 2 decades ago. And what we've done is we've got some ambitious goals. We want to build on our platform and our site an engaged audience. Our target is to try and get 100 million engaged viewers and audiences per month in over 24 countries, including Australia. And the way we do it is actually quite simple. We've developed an app. You can download it. It's called Global Citizen. We've got actions, we've got content, which we update on a regular basis. And one of the ways we get people engaged, hook them in the system, is we offer rewards. And actually right now, if you want to take it, you can enter, it takes 5 points. If you like Yusuf Cat Stevens, really great, performed at our festival last year, you can enter and go in the draw. We'll have others as well. And this is something which we've actually tried in New York City. We have a festival called the Global Citizen Festival, and you can see we've done it over many years. We've had everyone from Beyonce, Jay-Z, Coldplay, it's a hoot, and we've given away 60,000 tickets. And it's been amazing to watch this action and this draw. But what we're conscious of is that, does it result in impact? Because what we do with these actions is we might ask people to tweet a politician. We might ask people to tweet a foreign minister. I remember a few years ago when we launched our action, we were trying to get a meeting with the foreign minister of Sweden. I mentioned the issue of sanitation. We was trying to ask them. They had said, we're launching this feminist foreign policy. And we said, well, okay, if you're going to be serious and call yourselves feminists, what about the fact that one of the biggest barriers why girls don't go to school is because they lack proper functioning bathrooms, so that when they hit their menstruation cycle, They can go in there and they don't have to go home because too many girls drop out of school just because of the lack of a basic functioning toilet or bathroom. We said, would you champion this? And they refused to meet with us. So we thought, right. So in 24 hours, we had 18,000 tweets sent to this foreign minister. And I got a phone call. And it was from the Swedish embassy in Washington. And they said, the foreign minister, she's on a plane at the airport, and they're waiting to take off, and she actually wants to reply, but she can't because she's getting so many tweets. So can you ask your followers to stop, just so she can actually tweet and reply? And she met with us. And later on, her prime minister joined us on stage, and admittedly, I did say if he made this commitment, he could go on right before Beyonce, which he did. But he pledged there and then, spoke about menstruation, and trust me, getting a guy to talk about menstruation is hard. I've stood up and said in a room of mostly girls, and try and get guys along, I've often say, and I didn't quote this, I steal it unashamedly from one of my colleagues, but just imagine how different the world would be if men menstruated. So getting the Prime Minister on stage talking about this was a big thing in terms of dropping down these barriers. And over the years, we've had 11 million actions taken, $30 billion worth of commitments made, not necessarily delivered on, made, but if we hold them to account and they're delivered upon, we think it could affect the lives of 1 billion people. And you might ask yourself, well, how has this been in the last few months with the election of Donald Trump? And actually what we found, even without our rewards, we're not in festival season, we call it, we launched our festival lineup on Tuesday past week, but even before that, we found that the last 3 months broke all of our records. You see, people aren't complacent, people aren't willing to sit still, far from it. They're coming to our platform in droves, not just in America, we've had people all over the world saying, well, if they're not willing to lead, we will lead instead. We now have targets of 25, 30 million engaged audience a month. You know, we set this target for the end of next year. We've already smashed it. We're a quarter of the way towards our target of 100 million. And just last month, we were in Hamburg for the G20. Again, Justin Trudeau came. I did invite Malcolm, but he said he had better things to do. Maybe next time. But Australia, I mention that because I come back to Australia, and I love this country. I mean, I'm from Perth, and although I live in New York, I still very much believe that Australia does matter on the world stage, and that we can make a difference. Which is why it annoys me when I don't see our politicians leading, when they say we shouldn't lead, we should let others lead. You know, last week I watched on the news back in New York, and I saw Bill Shorten's speech about the Republic. Now, it doesn't matter what your views are. My British-born mum would hate me saying this. I mean, I consider myself a Republican, but also, come on, who cares? It's a great issue, but when there's so much stuff happening in the world, why aren't we also lead on that? Yes, let's deal with that. But what about some of these other issues? The fact you have 4 major famines happening right now. You've got them in Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, northern Nigeria, 30 million people on the brink of starvation, and 80%, 84% of the world's population don't even know about it. Surely we should be leading. Listen, I've long ago given up on waiting for others to lead. You know, one of my colleagues says, Michael, you know, we need to take the approach, we need to build it, and they will come. And I think in Australia, it's the same true for our politicians. We need to build that constituency here. So we started engaging. On my flight, I was sat next to a guy from Cricket Australia on the way down here, and I thought, yes, I've got one of them. And I immediately pitched in for tickets, so we'll see how we go to start that going. But we have tried this in other countries as well. And last year, I spent 3 months in India. You see, we decided that we were going to take our Global Citizen Festival on the road. And I spent 3 months in India. We felt that it needed to be a non-Western country. And India, you know, it's such a thriving democracy. It has 1.3 billion people, but also has many people around sanitation. 600 million people defecate in the open. 300 million people living in extreme poverty. But we knew that there was a burgeoning middle-class millennial vote there that was willing to get involved and engaged. So I spent 3 months there and was working together. And I started this by talking about a speech by Donald Trump. I'm going to come full circle and talk about a speech related to that election. You see, as we were there, and I watched the election, actually I was in India when it happened. It was actually the next day, as I was working, we were kind of in this free room this hotel had given us. It reminded me of being on school camp. Most of these Indian kids I was working with were like 18, 19, 20. I was considered old by being 28 there. And we were there, it smelled really bad, this room, I remember, and I was really angry at one point because something hadn't gone our way, so I went off in a huff, got myself a drink, and then came back. And then they said, come into this room, Hillary Clinton's about to give her concession speech. And I walked in and I stood at the back and everyone was watching it. We had young people from Norway, young people from India, young people from Australia, young people from America, from many different countries, Singapore, others, all dedicated to working on this program. And Hillary Clinton, you know, I didn't know what to expect, but there was a moment that she said where she specifically addressed young people. And she said to all the young people, you know, who are disappointed by this, you know, there will be ups and downs. And then she appealed to them. She said, never stop fighting for what you believe in. Fight, fight, fight for the rest of your life. And I looked at these young people, and I knew it was going to be okay. And just a few days later, in India, in Bombay, we had this huge event with 110,000 people. When I arrived in India, the media was saying it's the biggest thing to take place in India, music-wise, since Michael Jackson came in the late 90s. A week before it took place, they said it's the biggest music event to take place since the Beatles in the 1960s. The day of the event, or the day after, Rolling Stone said, it is the biggest event of its kind to take place in India. And this is what happened.
Let's go! You know I don't leave them, but I don't need them.
All my young friends, I stand between you and Coldplay. And so make this very, very brief. Everything you want is a dream away. We are diamonds taking shape.
Let's go out!
Friends, I've spent the last few years trying to understand how different movements work, how you engage people, and how you funnel that into a positive outlet of action. I can't attest to knowing the answers. I can't even tell you if this is going to work. It seems to, but only time will tell. But, you know, we've got to try. I can't live my life, you know, knowing that have I really done everything within my power to make a difference. And one of the last stories I want to leave you with, as I talk about movement makers and everything, you know, isn't the most sexiest of movements. I spoke before about my love of sanitation, and actually a thing I forgot to say is we actually did that event. The festival actually took place on World Toilet Day on November 19th, which Chris Martin of Coldplay, when he was telling the media, he said, by the way, today's World Toilet Day, which makes a lot of sense for those of you that associate Coldplay with toilets. Well, they do now. But, you know, sanitation workers. Now, it's not an easy thing, let's face it, in particular communities to try spending your time basically promoting the usage of toilets. And a few years ago, I went out to Madagascar where I was told there was some cool stuff happening. In Madagascar, 90% of the population live on just $2 a day. And they invited me to this event with all these workers, and the president, President Harry, came in and sat down at the start of this. And I remember one of the workers got up and he put on the slideshow, and the slide was actually a photo of feces poo. That was what it was. I thought, oh my God, this is the president here. What are you doing? And suddenly he got up and he said, friends, we live in a country with more than 40% defecate in the open. We live in a country where neighbors eat their other neighbors' feces. He said, this is not about health, this is about human dignity. And suddenly this guy, president remained calm, silent the whole time. Suddenly this guy and all these workers, he started chanting. He said, are we ready to do something about this? Yes. Do we think this is unacceptable? And everyone said yes. He said, do we think our leaders need to do something? Yes. He said, are we personally ready to do something about it? And they said yes. And then he turned to the president and then he said, are we ready, Mr. President, are you? What do you say to this? Suddenly it just went quiet. It was hushed. And the president got up. It was almost like no one knew what he was going to say. They told me afterwards that they duped him into coming. He didn't know it was going to be about feces and all this. He got told it was a public health seminar. But anyway, he got up and he walked up. It was quiet and he turned around and he just said, I am ready. And I saw these workers, they had brought about that change. They had created a movement around promoting the usage of toilets. If they can do that, then surely we can, here in Australia, build a movement around care and standing in solidarity with some of the most oppressed, vulnerable people in the world. A friend of mine, I was fortunate enough when he was in New York, Jan Eliasson, who recently retired as the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, former Foreign Minister of Sweden. He once said to me, he said, Michael, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So my question to you is, what are you going to do? I'm a global citizen. Are you? Thank you.